Shout out Miss Benny Ash. Yo, let me tell you about a case that went down. Schenck versus US were talking first crowd. Back in 1919 during World War I, speech was restricted and freedom was shunned. Schenck was a man who spoke against the war, passed flyers that caused idea of war. Government said it was clear violation of the Espionage Act. No hesitation. Schenck argued that his speech was protected. By the Constitution, he should not be neglected. The Supreme Court weighed in with a unanimous decision, saying that free speech has its limitation. They said in times of war, when the nation's at stake, certain speech can be restricted for the common good's sake. The famous line was going, clear and present danger is conviction against the highest ranger. So remember this case of Schenck v. US. When speaking up boldly, mindful of the fate, freedom is the speech of a cherished right, but in certain circumstances, it can be a fight. Thank you, Ms. Benny Ash.
Hello viewers, and welcome to the SSS Sesame Street Stories. As you just heard from the newly trending song, we'll be covering the Schenck versus United States case today. For some background info, Schenck was giving out anti-draft pamphlets during World War I, encouraging people not to join the draft for the military. This was around the time that Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917, which made it illegal to make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the U.S. military efforts. Schenck argued that the act violated the First Amendment's protection of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The question was, though, if it was okay to punish Schenck for speaking out against the draft under the Espionage Act. To provide more information about the case, I'm pleased to say we have the two leading justices of this controversial case today. Please welcome Justice Holmes and Justice McKenna. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Getting right into it, what were the different opinions of the court? Were any constitutional documents involved?
First of all, the case focused largely on the relationship between the Espionage Act of 1917 and its relationship with the civil liberty of the right of freedom of speech given by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The big question was if the prohibited speech of the Espionage Act, which led to Schenck's conviction, violated the First Amendment of Schenck and therefore was unconstitutional. Well, the majority of the judges thought that even though the First Amendment can be interpreted as a preventative measure against the punishment of speech and expression, the circumstances in which the speech was administered must be taken into consideration. Since Schenck's actions took place during World War I, a time when our nation was at war, Schenck's interference with the draft could have led to real, legitimate danger. A lack of soldiers to defend our nation against foreign enemies imposed a threat, where enemies could overwhelm our borders, leading to danger. It is agreed that speech or expressions that resulted in a clear and present danger fell under the category of unprotected speech, proving the right of freedom of speech is not absolute.
On the other hand, there were those of us who argued for Schenck, which revolved around the power of the First Amendment restricting the federal government from prohibiting criticism from the people. This is what Schenck did at the case's core. He did not call upon people to break the law, but to exercise their born rights given under the 13th Amendment of the prohibition of involuntary servitude. In addition, the First Amendment affirms the freedom of speech in public, which is how Schenck shared his opinions with the citizens of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Lastly, Schenck did not perform any actions that violated the law, like refusing to draft into the military, which is an action that the government can punish. However, since Schenck instead used his words in an attempt to persuade people not to serve, he is protected by the Constitution and should not be punished.
Now that we've learned both sides of the case, what was the final decision?
The court decided unanimously in favor of the United States, although it was agreed that the First Amendment did prevent prior restraint and the punishment of speech. The act depends on the context in which it was performed. So, when Schenck's speech attempted to disrupt the military operation of recruiting, which would inevitably lead to real danger, it was determined that Schenck's actions were not protected under the First Amendment of freedom of speech.
Something I remember saying while I delivered the decision was how free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater hall and causing a panic. The possibility of speech that leads to clear and present dangers are not protected by the First Amendment, proving that the conviction of Schenck due to his violation of the Espionage Act was not unconstitutional.
Well, thank you for joining us today and giving us a look inside the courtroom. Well, you heard it here, folks. The Schenck versus United States case had a tremendous effect on the interpretation of the First Amendment. Not only did it place a limit on the amendment, but it also did so in a manner that the federal government didn't have unlimited power. It protected the right of the people to speak out against the government in a manner that would not lead to a threat to the security of the nation. It made it clear that protection of the freedom of speech is not absolute. Lastly, but most importantly, it set a precedent for future cases on how to measure the intent of a speech and its likelihood to incite lawless activity. The clear and present danger test. However, the test was corrupted due to the government having the obvious favor in the rulings, leading to the speakers typically losing. The Brandenburg versus Ohio case followed 50 years later, which replaced the clear and present danger test, and with the Brandenburg test, which was more descriptive so that there was a clear distinction between protected and unprotected speech. This set a higher bar for the government to clear before silencing speech, which placed a check on its power to keep the people and the government balanced. Well, that's all for today. Tune in next time to hear what case Sesame Street Stories covers next.